The gong had not yet finished sounding when the doors of the great hall parted, and the woman in grey silk crossed the entire length of that glittering room, past duchesses and earls and men who had spent their whole lives waiting for a queen to so much as glance their way, and did not stop walking until she reached the servants' end of the table, where a governess in a mended blue gown sat with her hands folded and her eyes lowered, exactly where the Dowager Duchess had placed her an hour before to teach her a lesson about her proper station. The queen of the realm knelt, not curtsied, knelt on the cold marble floor in front of 400 witnesses, and took the governess's face in both her gloved hands, and said, in a voice that cracked with 20 years of grief, sister, before I tell you what happened in the silence that followed, a silence so complete that servants would later swear they heard candle wax dripping 3 rooms away, I want to ask you something. If you had spent your whole life being told you were nobody, and then a queen knelt at your feet and called you blood, would you believe her at once? Or would some old tired part of you still wait for the cruelty to come back and take it away? Tell me in the comments what you'd feel in that moment, and tell me where in the world you're watching from tonight. Subscribe if you believe the ones who are seated last are so very often the ones who deserve the seat of honour most. Because what happened at that ball did not simply humiliate a duchess who thought herself untouchable. It answered a question that had haunted a kingdom for 22 years. The question of what had become of a second princess, born in secret and lost in fire, who everyone but a dying nursemaid had long since given up for dead. But to understand how a governess with mended gloves came to be kneeling before a queen, we must go back. Back before the ball. Back before Camden Hall. Back to a night of smoke and screaming in a palace nursery 22 years before, when an infant girl was carried out through a servant's passage in the arms of a woman who loved her enough to disappear. The fire that took the west wing of the old palace that winter was, by the official account written into every history afterward, an accident of an untended hearth. It was not an accident. It was cover, struck deliberately by men in the pay of a cousin branch of the royal family who had grown tired of waiting their turn at a throne 2 healthy daughters stood between them, and who reasoned, in the cold arithmetic of ambition, that a single dead infant in a burned nursery would raise far fewer questions than a living one who might one day marry, one day bear an heir of her own, one day stand between them and a crown twice over instead of once. The elder princess, not yet 3 years old and sleeping in a different wing that night, was never in danger. It was the newborn who was meant to die in that fire, a girl not yet 6 weeks old, born of the old king's second wife, who had died bringing her into the world and left behind, in her final delirious hours, only a single instruction to the nursemaid she trusted above all others, if anything should ever happen, take her to safety, and tell no one. Not even the king, until you are certain it is safe to do so. The nursemaid's name was Bess Hollis, and when she woke that night to smoke curling beneath the nursery door and the sound of men's boots in a corridor where no men's boots ought to have been, she did not scream for help. She wrapped the infant princess in a plain wool blanket, took nothing else from that grand nursery but a small locket the girl's dead mother had left for her, and carried her out through a servant's passage built 2 centuries before for exactly this sort of desperate flight, into a night so cold it burned the lungs. and did not stop walking until the palace was 3 days behind her and the child had a new name. She called the girl Rose. It was, Bess would say in later years, the only lie she ever told with a clean conscience, because in every way that mattered the child was not the palace's daughter any longer, but hers, raised in a rented cottage on the edge of a market town where no one asked too many questions of a widow and her infant granddaughter, taught her letters at a kitchen table scrubbed pale with age, taught to sew and to cook and to read by candlelight because oil was dear and books were dearer still, taught above all else, though she would not understand the full weight of this teaching until decades later, that kindness cost nothing and was worth more than any crown. Rose grew up believing herself an orphan of no particular consequence, the granddaughter of a woman who had once, she was told, been in service to a fine house before some unspoken misfortune had turned her out. She grew up poor and clever and quiet in the particular way of children who have learned early that drawing attention rarely brings anything good. She grew up, in short, exactly as any overlooked ordinary girl in that kingdom might have grown, entirely unaware that the locket her grandmother kept locked in a tin box beneath the floorboard bore, on its reverse, a crest that half the great houses of the realm would have recognized on sight, had any of them ever thought to look at a laundress's granddaughter closely enough to notice she wore one at all. Bess Hollis died when Rose was 19, of a wasting illness that took the better part of a year to finish its work. And in the last week of it, with a fever loosening whatever careful silence had bound her for 2 decades, she pressed the locket into Rose's hand and said the only words about the girl's true origins she would ever say aloud. "You are more than you have ever been told, child," she whispered, her grip fever strong around Rose's fingers. "There is a crest on the back of that locket, and a story behind it I was sworn never to tell until I was certain it was safe, and I have run out of time to be certain of anything at all. Find someone who knows the crest. Trust no one else until you do. And Rose, whatever you learn, remember that the woman who loved you first was not the woman whose blood you carry, but the woman who chose you anyway." She died 2 nights later, and Rose, grieving and entirely alone in the world for the first time in her life, did what practical, unsentimental orphans have always done with mysteries they have no means of solving. She wrapped the locket in a handkerchief, placed it at the bottom of her one travelling trunk, and went looking for honest work, because grief, however deep, does not pay rent. She found it 3 months later in a newspaper advertisement seeking a governess companion for the young ward of the Duke of Camden, a position that paid modestly but included board, and required, the advertisement specified with evident weariness, a candidate of patience, education, and unshakable good humour, the previous 3 governesses having each departed within the season. Rose arrived at Camden Hall on a grey October afternoon with rain threatening and her trunk balanced on her knees in a hired cart, and found the great house every bit as imposing as its reputation. Stone the colour of old bone, ivy clawing up 3 stories of windows, and a household staff who regarded her, on her first evening, with the particular weary sympathy of people watching a 4th lamb led toward a slaughter they had already witnessed 3 times. The Duke himself, Julian Ashworth, received her in his study with a coldness she would later understand had very little to do with her personally, and a great deal to do with a broken engagement 2 years prior. a fashionable, celebrated fiancé who had cried off the match within a week of learning the extent of his debts, choosing instead a marquis whose fortune came with fewer complications, and leaving the Duke with a settled conviction that warmth was simply another currency people spent when it suited them and withdrew the moment it did not. "You will find my sister difficult," the Duke informed her, without looking up from the ledger on his desk, in the clipped voice of a man who had said the same sentence to 3 governesses before her and expected no different result this time. "She has driven off better women than you with less education, and I have neither the patience nor the inclination to mediate the battle. See that she learns her letters and does not set fire to anything, and we shall get along tolerably well." He was, Rose would learn within the week, entirely wrong about his sister and only half wrong about himself. Lady Cecily Ashworth was 8 years old, motherless since infancy, and largely fatherless since her own father's death 3 years before had left her brother. Barely 21 at the time, thrust into a dukedom and a guardianship he had neither wanted nor prepared for, and the child's difficulty, Rose discovered within days, was not cruelty but grief, wearing the costume of mischief. A small girl testing every new governess to see how quickly this one too would tire of her and leave. Rose did not tire. She met each small rebellion, hidden schoolbooks, a frog deposited with great ceremony in a wash-basin, a flat refusal to practice penmanship that lasted the better part of a fortnight, with the same steady, unshakable patience Bess Hollis had once shown a grieving, difficult orphan of her own, and by the second month Cecily had stopped testing and started, cautiously, trusting. Appearing at Rose's door each morning, not from obligation but from a genuine wish for her company, and confiding, one rainy afternoon over a shared pot of chocolate, that she had liked none of the previous governesses because none of them had ever once asked her what she thought about anything. Only what she had memorized. It was this same quiet competence, extended without calculation to a lonely child, that first began to soften something in the Duke himself, though he would not have admitted it, and did not, for a long while, entirely understand it in himself. He began, by the winter, to linger in the doorway of the schoolroom on his way past, ostensibly to check on his sister's progress, staying rather longer than any such check required to listen to Rose explain a point of history or coax a reluctant sum out of Cecily with more warmth than accuracy. He began to notice, with the particular irritation of a man determined not to notice anything at all, that his sister laughed more often, that the house itself seemed to have grown a few degrees warmer since October, and that the governess responsible for both changes never once, in all her dealings with him, flattered him, sought his notice, or behaved as though his title were a thing to be managed rather than simply a fact about him, incidental to the conversation. She corrected him once, gently but without apology, on a point of household economy he had gotten wrong, in nearly the same tone Eleanor Hartley might once have used on a ruined ledger, and he found to his genuine surprise that he respected her more for it rather than less. By spring he sought her opinion on matters well beyond his sister's education, and told himself each time that this was merely practicality, and each time believed it a little less. It was in April, while helping the housekeeper turn out a long-neglected linen room in the attic story in search of a christening gown Cecily had asked after, that Rose's locket slipped free of the fichu at her collar and caught the light from a dusty window, and old Whitlock, the butler, who had climbed the stairs uninvited to see what the commotion was about, and happened to be standing in the doorway at that exact moment, went the colour of tallow and had to steady himself against the frame. He said nothing that day beyond a mumbled excuse and a hasty retreat, but Rose noticed the way his hands had trembled, and noticed, too, that he began afterward to watch her with an attention that was neither the ordinary courtesy of a servant nor anything she could readily explain, a mixture of grief and disbelief, and something that looked, unaccountably, like hope. It was another week before he found the courage to approach her privately. In the still room after the household had retired, his candle throwing long shadows across a face gone suddenly older than she had ever seen it. "Forgive an old man's forwardness, Miss Hale," he said, "but I served in the royal household 40 years past before ever I came to Camden, and I was in that house the night of the nursery fire that took the young king's second daughter, or was said to have taken her, for the body they recovered was never shown to any who might have questioned it too closely, and there were those of us below stairs who always wondered. That locket you wear, miss, I have seen its twin exactly once before in my life, worn by a queen who has since gone grey waiting for a sister she was told died in a fire before she was old enough to properly remember her face." Rose did not sleep at all that night. She sat instead by her narrow window with the locket open in her palm, turning Bess Hollis's dying words over and over. "You are more than you have ever been told, child," until the shape of a truth she had never once permitted herself to imagine began, slowly and terribly, to assemble itself into something she could no longer dismiss as an old woman's fever dream. She was not the granddaughter of a laundress turned out from a fine house. She was, if Whitlock's memory and a locket's crest could be trusted, the king's own second daughter, believed murdered in a fire that had in truth taken no one at all, hidden for 22 years by a woman who had loved her enough to disappear entirely from her own life to keep her safe. She possessed no proof beyond an old servant's memory and a piece of jewellery any skilled forger might have copied. She possessed, above all, no notion whatsoever of how a governess with mended gloves might go about proving such a claim to a kingdom, let alone to a queen, without being dismissed as either a lunatic or an opportunist the very instant she attempted it. She resolved, that night, to say nothing to anyone until she understood a great deal more than she presently did, a resolution that lasted precisely 11 days, until the household's other secret keeper decided her silence had gone on a great deal too long already, for reasons entirely his own. Mr. Josiah Crane had managed the Camden estate's finances, and a rather more discreet portfolio of crown business besides, for 19 years, ever since the old Duke's death had left a green young heir grateful for any steady hand willing to shoulder the tedium of accounts. What no one at Camden Hall knew, what only a handful of clerks in a dusty Crown office 3 counties distant had ever known, and Crane had spent 2 decades ensuring stayed that way, was that among the discreet Crown business under his management sat a trust established quietly by the old king himself in the weeks after his second daughter's presumed death. A fund set aside against the slim, unlikely chance she might one day be found alive, administered by exactly the sort of solicitor no one thought to examine too closely, and drained by that same solicitor, shilling by careful shilling, across 19 patient years into investments and properties that bore his name and no one else's. A missing princess who stayed missing was worth, to Josiah Crane, considerably more than one who came home. When word reached him, through a maidservant he paid rather better than her modest wages for exactly this sort of gossip, that old Whitlock had gone pale over a governess's locket and been seen whispering with her in the still-room at midnight, he understood at once, with the particular clarity of a guilty man, exactly what was at stake and exactly how little time he had to prevent it. He went first to the Dowager Duchess, the Duke's formidable aunt, Lady Camden, who had run the household's social affairs with an iron correctness since the old Duke's death, and had watched her nephew's growing regard for a penniless governess with an alarm she had, until now, lacked sufficient ammunition to properly voice. Crane did not tell her the truth. He told her instead a version of it carefully bent to his purpose, that the governess Hale had been overheard making wild and self-serving claims of royal blood to the butler, plainly hoping to trade on old Whitlock's sentimental credulity to secure a match above her station, and that unless the household nipped such a scandalous fraud in the bud at once, the Duke risked making a fool of the entire family before the whole of society. It was, for the Dowager, precisely the confirmation she had been waiting for, and she acted upon it with the speed of a woman who had spent a lifetime believing that birth was destiny and that a governess who forgot her place deserved to be reminded of it publicly, thoroughly, and without mercy. The reminder came a fortnight later, on the evening of the grandest event Camden Hall had hosted in a decade, a ball held in honour of a state visit from the Queen herself, travelling the kingdom that season to open a new hospital wing 2 counties distant, and gracing Camden with a single celebrated evening on her progress. An honour the Dowager had spent 3 months arranging down to the last candle, and had no intention of allowing a presumptuous governess to overshadow. When the seating was posted that afternoon, Rose found her name not among the family's table, where Cecily had proudly assumed she would sit, but at the very foot of the servants' hall, below the housekeeper, below the ladies' maids, in a place so deliberately, publicly humiliating that even the scullery girls exchanged uneasy glances reading it. Julian, discovering the arrangement only an hour before the guests arrived and confronting his aunt over it, received in return a cold recitation of exactly the accusations Crane had planted, that the governess had been spreading dangerous, self-aggrandizing falsehoods about her own birth, that the family's reputation could not survive the scandal of appearing to indulge such a fraud on the very evening a queen graced their table, and that if he valued his household standing at all, he would leave the matter as arranged, and address his infatuation once the royal visit had safely concluded. Julian, torn between a devotion he had not yet fully named even to himself, and a lifetime's training in exactly the kind of social caution his aunt was invoking, did not overrule her. It was, he would tell Rose much later, the single decision of his life he regretted most bitterly, and the one he understood, even as he made it, he was making wrongly. Worse followed within the hour. A ring belonging to the Dowager, a modest sapphire she rarely wore but valued for its age, went missing from her dressing-table that same afternoon, and was discovered by a chambermaid conveniently summoned to search at exactly the right moment, tucked inside the lining of Rose's travelling trunk, precisely where Crane's paid maidservant had hidden it 2 nights before, while Rose sat late in the schoolroom with Cecily's arithmetic. The Dowager did not trouble herself with an investigation. She summoned Rose to the drawing-room before the whole senior staff, pronounced her a thief as well as a liar, and dismissed her from the household service that same afternoon. mere hours before the Queen's own carriage was expected at the gates, with instructions that she be gone from Camden Hall before a single guest arrived to witness the embarrassment of her continued presence. Rose did not weep in that drawing-room, though the accusation struck her with a force greater than any poverty she had known as a girl, because poverty had never once called her dishonest, only unlucky. She packed her single trunk with hands that would not entirely stop trembling, said a goodbye to a devastated, uncomprehending Cecily that broke something in her she was not certain would mend, and walked the 3 miles to the village inn in a cold spring rain, because the dowager had refused her the use of even the smallest cart, carrying with her nothing of value in all the world beyond a locket, a handkerchief, and a grief too large to properly hold. It was Whitlock, sick with guilt at his own part in stirring a truth he had never meant to endanger her with, who went to the Duke that same evening as the first carriages began arriving, and told him plainly what his own conscience had been shouting for hours, that a ring conveniently discovered in a trunk that had not been out of the schoolroom's sight in a week bore every mark of a plant, that a maidservant recently much improved in her wardrobe had been seen in close conversation with Mr. Crane on more than one occasion, and that a solicitor who managed both the estate's accounts and, as it happened, a portion of unclaimed Crown business besides, had rather more reason than most to want a certain governess discredited before her claim could ever be properly examined. Julian, standing in his own hallway in his evening coat, with guests already filling the ballroom and a Queen's carriage no more than 20 minutes distant, understood in the space of that single conversation exactly how thoroughly he had failed the one person in 2 years who had never once asked anything of him but honesty, and did the only thing his conscience would permit. He sent his fastest rider for the inn at once, with instructions that would have scandalized his aunt considerably more than any governess's supposed presumption ever could, and turned, grim-faced, to begin unravelling 19 years of careful theft in the 20 minutes remaining before his most important guest arrived. The ballroom, when Rose was half carried, half persuaded back through its doors an hour into the evening, road damp and dishevelled and entirely unprepared for the 400 candlelit guests already assembled, was exactly as grand as its reputation promised, and exactly as merciless. The dowager, catching sight of her from across the room, did not hesitate. She crossed the floor with the swift, cold purpose of a woman determined to finish a lesson she had begun that afternoon, and before Julian could reach them, had steered Rose bodily to the farthest, lowest end of the servants' table at the hall's rear, hissing beneath her breath that a common thief dismissed that very morning had no business whatsoever beneath a chandelier meant for honest guests, and that she would sit exactly where her station demanded, or be removed from the house entirely before the Queen's own eyes could be troubled by the sight of her. Rose sat. She had learned across 22 years of quiet endurance precisely how to sit through a humiliation without letting it break her face open, and she folded her hands in her lap and lowered her eyes, and waited, not for rescue, for she had long since stopped believing rescue was a thing the world reliably offered, but simply for the evening to end. The doors opened at the stroke of 9, and the Queen of the realm entered Camden Hall to a room that rose as one body. 400 guests bending into curtsies and bows, so uniform they might have been a single great wave breaking silently across the marble floor. She was younger than her portrait suggested, and wearier, A woman whose face had learned long ago to hold court over a private grief no ceremony ever fully lifted, and she moved through the receiving line with the practiced warmth of a monarch who had greeted 10,000 strangers and remembered genuinely to be kind to each one. It was perhaps a quarter of an hour into the formal presentations, as the Queen turned from the Duke's own bow toward the assembled room beyond him, that her eyes caught, for no reason any witness could afterward properly explain, beyond the simple, inexplicable pull of blood toward blood across a crowded room, a small glint of gold at the collar of a governess seated, inexplicably, among the servants at the hall's farthest end. She paused mid-step. Several guests would later swear the entire orchestra faltered for half a bar, though the musicians themselves denied it. The Queen crossed the floor. She did not send an attendant. She did not summon the governess forward as protocol and every rule of precedence would have demanded. She walked, herself, the full and considerable length of that glittering room, past duchesses who had spent that same morning practicing exactly the curtsy they now held frozen and unacknowledged, past the Dowager Lady Camden, whose face had gone the colour of old paper, and did not stop until she stood directly before the servants' table, before a woman in a mended blue gown who had risen, bewildered and trembling, the moment she understood who approached. The Queen looked at her for a long moment, at the shape of a jaw she had spent 2 decades trying to remember from a mother's portrait, at eyes the exact clouded blue of a sapphire locket she herself had worn a twin of every day since childhood, and then, in front of 400 witnesses who would tell this story for the rest of their lives, she knelt. "Show me the locket," she said, and her voice was not the voice of a monarch, but of a sister who had grieved alone for 22 years. Rose's hands shook so badly it took her 3 attempts to work the clasp free, and when at last she held it out, the Queen took it in trembling fingers, turned it to catch the candlelight, and pressed her own matching locket from beneath her collar beside it, the 2 crests meeting edge to edge exactly as they had been cut 2 decades before. From a single seal broken deliberately in half by a dying queen who had wanted her daughters, whatever else befell them, to always carry a way of finding one another again. "Sister," the Queen said, and this time her voice did break, entirely and without royal restraint, before the whole assembled hall. "My sister, they told me you had died in that fire. I lit a candle for you every winter of my life, and I never once stopped hoping it was a lie." The silence that followed was the kind that seems, afterward, to have lasted an hour, though witnesses agreed it could not have been longer than a few seconds. A silence broken first by the Dowager Lady Camden's teacup, which slipped from her nerveless hand and shattered against the marble with a sound that made half the room flinch. And second, by Josiah Crane, who had gone the colour of ash the instant the Queen crossed the floor, and now attempted, with the particular clumsiness of a guilty man discovering too late that he has no exit remaining, to slip toward the terrace doors, only to find them already occupied by 2 of the Queen's own guardsmen, summoned that afternoon by Julian's rider, along with the Crown Clerk, whose testimony would, within the week, unravel 19 years of quietly stolen trust funds down to the last falsified ledger line. Whitlock, standing near the wall with tears running unashamedly down a face 40 years in royal and ducal service, said afterward that it was the single proudest moment of his life, to have been the one small trembling voice that had first said the word sister aloud in that house, weeks before a queen ever said it herself. What followed in the days after was reckoning, delivered with a speed and thoroughness that satisfied even the servants who had watched Rose's dismissal with helpless anger that morning. Josiah Crane was arrested within the hour, his counting-house records seized before dawn, and stood trial that autumn for the theft of Crown funds on a scale that ended not merely his liberty, but the whole careful architecture of respectability he had spent 2 decades building atop another family's grief. The Dowager Lady Camden, stripped by the Queen's own explicit and icily gracious command of any further role in matters of royal precedence, withdrew from society altogether within the season. Her invitations quietly declining year upon year, until the great houses of the kingdom had, by unspoken but universal agreement, simply stopped extending them. The maidservant who had planted the ring, given the choice between prosecution and confession, chose confession, and cleared Rose's name so thoroughly and so publicly that the story of the governess falsely called a thief became, within weeks, as celebrated a tale as the story of the princess found alive. Julian went to Rose the very night the ballroom finally cleared, finding her at last alone on the terrace where she had slipped away from the crush of well-wishers to simply breathe, the 2 halves of a broken seal still cradled together in her palm. He did not begin with an apology, though he owed her a considerable one, and gave it fully before the night was through. He began instead with the truth he had been too cautious, too guarded, too long burned by a world of superficial affection to say plainly, until a queen's kneeling had shown him exactly what plain, unguarded devotion looked like. "I loved you before I had the smallest notion who you were," he said, "and I find I love you rather more now, not because a crown has attached itself to your name, but because you sat through every cruelty this house offered you without once becoming cruel yourself, and I do not believe I deserve a woman of such character, only that I intend, for whatever years remain to me, to try to become worthy of her regardless." Rose, who had spent 22 years being told she was ordinary and one extraordinary evening discovering she was a princess, found that of everything said to her that night, it was this: a duke's plain, unpolished honesty on a cold terrace, asking for nothing but the chance to earn her, that finally, fully, undid her composure at last. Princess Rosalind, as she came to be known across the kingdom, chose in the end to keep her modest name of Rose for everyday use among those who had loved her before they knew what she was, and married the Duke of Camden the following spring in a ceremony that filled the old palace chapel with a warmth its stone walls had not held in living memory, her sister the Queen standing as witness with tears she made no attempt to hide. Lady Cecily, restored at once to the sister-in-law she adored, grew into a young woman as generous and unpretentious as the governess who had first taught her that being asked what she thought mattered more than being told what to memorize. And in the years that followed, the tenants and townsfolk of Camden told the story of that ball the way such stories are always told best, not as a tale of a lucky orphan elevated by fortune, but as a tale of a woman who had been kind and steady and unbroken through every humiliation a cruel world could arrange for her, long before any crown ever proved she had deserved better all along, and who, once elevated, spent the whole of her new power making certain that no governess, no maid, and no forgotten child in any house she governed would ever again be made to sit, unseen and unvalued, at the farthest end of any table.